Good morning and welcome to Sunday Morning Live. I'm Sian Williams. On today's programme, Paris is in mourning after gun and bomb attacks killed 129 people. David Cameron says we face the same threat. So what should our response be? Are you an addict? More than 2 million adults in England are said to be. Peter Hitchens caused a stir here a few months ago after saying there's no such thing as addiction. He's back to explain why. Culture clash as more than 1,000 artists boycott Israel over its policies. Others, like J.K. Rowling, say sharing culture is a power for good. Who's right? And the veteran war photographer Don McCullin explains what makes a good picture as he helps pick a winner for this year's Faith Through a Lens competition, which explores images of religion.
I thought religion was about devotion and respect and love. And all I've seen is the kind of cruelty that sometimes religion, when it goes wrong, it doesn't go wrong, it's the people who observe it who go wrong. They go too far.
And as ever, Tommy Sandu is here to share your thoughts at home with us this morning. Good morning, Tommy.
Good morning, Sian, and good morning to you at home as well. If you always watch the show but you never get in touch, let this week be the first time that you do. Very easy to get your comments into the show. Find us on Facebook, the Sunday Morning Live page, and post your comments there. On Twitter, it's at BBC SML, and don't forget to use the hashtag BBC SML as well. Or you can call us, the number 03030 833 833. Standard geographic charges from landlines and mobiles will of course apply. You can text us, it's 81771, and text will be charged at your standard message rate. Or you can email the show, it's sundaymorninglive@bbc.co.uk, which is also the email address to send in your video reactions on your phone or on your tablet. A few seconds, let's get your comments and even your face on this screen. Sian.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Let's meet our guest this week. Osama Hassan is from the anti-extremism think tank Quilliam Foundation. Peter Hitchens is a columnist at the Mail on Sunday. Douglas Murray is Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. And Yasmin Alibhai-Brown is a columnist at The Independent. Welcome to you all, and thanks very much for being with us this morning. They killed people out enjoying a Friday evening in Paris at a rock concert, a football friendly in bars and in restaurants. By the end of the night, nearly 130 were dead, more than 350 injured. So-called Islamic State say they carried out the series of gun and bomb attacks, calling France a top target. Two of those targets were the Bataclan concert venue and the Stade de France. The stadium was hosting a match between France and Germany. It was watched by President Hollande. Declaring a state of emergency, he called the attacks an act of war, vowing to wage a merciless fight against the terrorists. Here, David Cameron offered British help and summoned his cabinet for an emergency meeting. There's another emergency meeting today. You're now going to see extra police at ports and at public events in the coming days. Authorities have called for more vigilance from the British public too. And while security is paramount, is there anything else that can be done? Our question this morning, how should Britain react to the attacks in Paris? Well, as well as our panellists, also joining us from our newsroom this morning in Birmingham is Dr. Chris Allen, who's a lecturer in social policy at the University of Birmingham and author of a book called Islamophobia. Good morning to you, sir. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks.
Be with you in just a sec, but I want to start with Peter first. I heard the Home Secretary Theresa May on the Andrew Marr show talking about this public vigilance, this increased security. Is that going to be enough, do you think?
I think there's a great tendency on these occasions for anyone in government and in the civil service and the security services to act on the maxim, never let a good crisis go to waste. There are people who want more surveillance, there are people who want to limit our liberties even more. They'll use this as a pretext. Frankly, this seems to me to be unthinking. We need to react with calm and with caution and with a great deal of thought to these things, not immediately to say, let's have more of the security, which has failed. France, I think, is probably a more secure country in most terms than we are. It has a stronger state, it has more surveillance. This hasn't protected Paris from what's happened. The idea that it will, the idea that that these attempts can ever be wholly prevented seems to me to be mistaken. So let's think very carefully what we do before we rush into yet another raft of measures which will make us more miserable, will do to some extent the terrorists' work by changing our societies into less tolerant, less free places, and won't actually do any good.
It's hard, isn't it, Yasmin, though, to have this feeling of calm when there is panic, there is a lot of fear, both in Paris, of course, in France, but also in Britain as well. And the pressure on politicians to do something and to be seen to be doing something is quite intense at the moment.
Yes, and I do admire the stance Peter is taking. But I really am myself who've kind of hung on to this idea of our liberties and suspicion of the state, which I still feel very deeply, just as deeply as Peter Hitchens. I really think that we're in a different order with ISIS. I mean, on Thursday, something like 50 people were blown up in the Lebanon, and hundreds were injured. There isn't a day goes by now where they're not hyperactive here, there, or everywhere. And it's been going on since 1981.
So they're uncontrollable.
But certainly this, if it is an organisation, this lot, this connection, if you like, seems very much more able to do stuff. And so I reluctantly have come to the conclusion this weekend that, yes, up to a point I'm prepared to put up with increased, I can never say this word, surveillance. Knowing full well what Peter said, that the powerful will grab as much power as they can.
OK. Douglas, do we have to give up a bit of our liberty in order to increase our protection?
No, I don't think so. And I pretty much agree with everything that's just been said by Peter and a lot of what's just been said by Yasmin. I think that you have to be very careful after these events. You don't leap around, as you say, become hyperactive about it. And I also think that there is a huge problem of rhetoric from politicians about this. We'll see whether President Hollande is indeed merciless towards ISIS. We'll see whether, instead, we don't have a phase like I think we've had in the UK, and I think we've arguably had across Europe, where whenever we talk about this subject, our politicians do an extraordinary mix of grandiosity and tinkering.
Well, the word
they
war
say
has
we
been
are
used
at they say we are at war with an existential threat, and it is the threat of our time. And then they say, and in response, we must extend surveillance here, or we must do this, or we must do that. This is not up to the challenge. If you accept that the challenge is there, and I think that it is, if you accept that it is that, then you do not simply tinker.
What do you do?
Well, all sorts of things. One of the things, by the way, that has to be said, one of the things, you would make sure you knew who was coming into your country and you knew who was here. And it is insane that in recent years, at the same time as saying there is an element within Islamic communities, whatever percentage you think it is, which has the potential to be radicalized, which has the potential to have these medieval ideas. If you believe that is true, and now the mainstream politicians across Europe all say that is true, why on earth would you bring an unprecedented number of people from the Muslim world into Europe? Why would you do it?
Osama?
Because the free movement of peoples is also one of our core values in Europe, and we believe in universal human rights. European values of liberty, equality, fraternity are not just European or Western ones. They are Muslim ones as well. The vast majority of the Muslim world, the very young population, they are polled, and they want these kinds of values. They don't want dictators, and many of them are escaping terrorist groups like ISIS by coming into Europe, and by showing them that generosity, we are actually undermining the terrorist narrative who are trying to pit them against us. So we actually have to stick to our principles and values and welcome strangers and refugees, because the vast majority will contribute to this society. We have to deal with the terrorist military threat of ISIS. Absolutely, we are at war with them.
Osama, nobody wants you to be right more than I do. Okay? Take a poll that came out earlier this year. The BBC conducted it after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, the last massacre in Paris. The BBC poll said that 27% of British Muslims polled said they had sympathy with the attackers in Paris. 27%. It's not a majority. I grant you. It's just a quarter. It's just a quarter.
We have to deal with the chance.
Hang on, one at a time. Yasmin.
Yeah.
No, I mean, of course there are anxieties, and according to some papers, 2 of the people they think were involved came in through this route of seeking asylum.
Came through Greece from Syria.
most
Free
of the
Greece.
people who are escaping Syria are not ISIS.
Sure.
They're escaping from ISIS. And you shouldn't judge. That's the thing that I'm saying very strongly, that in some ways we Muslims have to stop seeing ourselves primarily as Muslims and see ourselves more as Europeans. There's been a terrible influence of Saudi Arabia that has been allowed to corrupt us. But equally, the Europeans should stop casting us as Muslims first and citizens next. All of that will make a difference. And I am not, like Osama, saying, you know, there isn't a problem. There is a big problem. But we need to be, if we're going to be calm, we also need to give some credence to the idea that most of those people who are coming here are desperate.
But it only takes one, Yasmin.
It takes one, but there
or
are
two.
criminals coming in
Okay.
every day. Criminals come in from everywhere.
We're in danger of missing 2 points. First of all, there's a perfectly sound argument for having controlled borders, even if there were no terrorist attacks at all. And I don't think that using a terrorist attack as a pretext for this argument is particularly a good idea. Terrorist attack is bad in its own right, and we respond to it in its own right. If you mean by open borders that you have a wholly undiscriminating system where people can just walk into a country without anybody knowing who they are or where they come from, then I think any reasonable person must be against that. The really curious thing about the European Union is that its current policy is exactly that. People can come in unchecked, undocumented, and they can then move unchecked throughout the entire European Union because of the Schengen Agreement. That would seem to me to be crazy under any circumstances, even if there were no terrorist attacks. And I'd be amazed that anyone would defend that if that's what you mean by open borders. But there is a much more serious point about this, is that what actually is IS? What is the nature of its threat to us? And how, if it is such a threat to us, are we going to combat it? Now, I think a lot of the solutions to this lie not in domestic but in foreign policy. We've been most reluctant, for instance, to ally properly with the Kurds, who've been the most effective fighters against ISIS on the ground. We've been most unwilling to ally with Iran, and we've been extremely critical of Russia, which has also been rather more effective in holding up the Syrian regime, which is one of ISIS's principal opponents, than we have. We might reconsider some of these things if we're serious about opposing and defeating ISIS as a major force.
Okay. I want to bring in Dr. Chris Allen from our newsroom in Birmingham. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Allen. But is there an answer to this? Does it lie in a change in foreign policy? Does it lie in perhaps getting rid of the Schengen Agreement, the Open Borders Agreement, and having a more rigorous approach towards people who are coming into Europe? What's your answer?
Well, from listening to the discussion so far, I think what's really interesting for me is the way in which we've started with one thing and kind of got to something completely different. And, you know, if you look at the language that's been used, we're talking about Muslims as a blanket community around the world. So we've been talking about Muslims in Syria and Iraq in the same way we're talking about Muslims in Britain. We're talking about immigration, which is not necessarily a Muslim issue. You know, this is an issue which is quite different and distinct. But now suddenly we're talking about immigration as though it's actually problematic because of Muslims coming to this country. And I think one of the things that we really need to do here is to kind of like, you know, begin to differentiate between a lot of these different debates and discussions that are taking place. And if we're talking about this issue around sort of what's happening in Paris and what should we do, I think the message is actually one of calm. You know, if we look in after 7/7 and Lee Rigby and all these things, these were actually on British soil. You know, so these are things which impact, you know, Britain directly. And, you know, what we have now is something which has taken place in Paris, which is, you know, which is horrific. But is it actually going to affect us in Britain at the moment? You know, and we're talking as though now there's going to be an attack here imminently, you know, and I think that this is just very, very worrying. I think that what we need to do is we need to have a little bit of nuance, we need to have a little bit of calm, and I think actually one of the ways forward is to actually look at this as an intelligence issue, you know, and actually talk about sort of, you know, these other issues in a much more kind of balanced and nuanced way.
Douglas, is it an intelligence issue? I mean, obviously not solely an intelligence issue, but did intelligence let everybody down in Paris?
Well, first, I don't think anyone or anything that's been said so far in this study lacks nuance. I think a rather patronising dismissal of the idea that it does is in another attempt, which always happens after events like this, to change the point or to limit the discussion. Actually, this is, as I say, a very, very large issue. It's a societal issue. It's a cultural issue. What happened in Paris the other night, it wasn't the first time it's happened. It goes on and on and on. It is not possible to have that discussion and police and to make sure that all sorts of elements of it we don't have. We have to have the full discussion.
So would you have the full
Intelligence
discussion, for example, about, before you, just to pick up on that point, would you have a full discussion about airstrike, not just airstrikes in Syria, because of course that was voted down a couple of years ago in the House of Commons,
Well, no.
to come back here, but other things? Is it boots on the ground? Is it absolutely trying to get rid of ISIS once and for all in Syria?
I said a long time ago, it's a perfectly legitimate objective, once ISIS carried out an attack on another country, for that country to use every bit of military force it has to destroy that group. What was proposed 2 years ago was not that. What was proposed 2 years ago were punitive strikes against the Assad regime. You may agree with that or not. I actually disagreed with punitive strikes against the Assad regime because I thought it would topple the Assad regime and meant that we would own Syria when we didn't want to own Syria. But strikes against ISIS obviously are legitimate. As for quickly the surveillance issue, you can have all of the surveillance in the world and things like this can still happen. You will never be secure enough that a barbarian will not get hold of a Kalashnikov somewhere and go and massacre people for the crime of going to a restaurant. You will never have enough surveillance. And we should not blame security services either here or in Paris for not being able to prevent that happening at any time, all the time.
All right, Osama, can I just hear from Osama, because I haven't heard from him for a while. Is it about then taking a different approach, as far as we're concerned, in foreign policy towards Syria, going in there a lot harder than anyone has done?
No, I think we should call a spade a spade. In Syria, you have a brutal regime of Assad, which has killed over 200,000 people. And we have a brutal group like ISIS, murdering thousands of people also, mainly Muslims. We need a political solution to Syria, to end the war.
But what is
well
that political solution?
Well, there are talks going on in Vienna. There are so many powers. The reason we haven't allied with the Kurds as much is because Turkey is an ally and opposed to the Turkish group, for example. And of course there are obvious problems with Iran and Russia supporting Assad. But coming back to an earlier point, we do need that debate to continue. You mentioned Charlie Hebdo correctly. A lot of Muslims falsely thought that these were blasphemous cartoons depicting the Prophet. Within a year, I think opinion has moved on amongst British and European Muslim communities because, for example, Charlie Hebdo also published a cartoon about Aylan Kurdi, the boy who was drowned, a cartoon about the Russian plane that was brought down by a bomb, which many Russians were offended by. And so people are beginning to understand that, many people get offended by the unique satirical nature of Charlie Hebdo. We have to continue that discussion so that people don't sympathise with these kinds of murderers anymore. And we're moving in the right direction in Britain and Europe. We have to continue
so have open, honest conversations.
Yes, citizenship.
So I really do want to give some credit to the security services here. I know for a fact, and the police too, that some terrible disasters have been prevented. They don't talk about them. They can't talk about them sometimes. The downside of that is too often blameless Muslims are held without charge and so on, and that needs to change. I think we have to maintain those rights. But there has been some good work done by people to keep us safe, so we shouldn't dismiss what they've been able to do.
Don't overrate these organisations. James Bond is fiction and so is spooks. There's surprisingly little they can do, and the fundamental thing they are not and never will be is clairvoyant. They simply can't tell what's going to happen before it happens. And the idea that by intense surveillance and more poking into our lives they will do so is false.
What is the answer then, Peter?
Well, why are we always looking for the answer? If there had been a plane crash, we would get hold of the flight recorders and we would look to see what had happened in detail, and we would in detail work to ensure it didn't happen again. The same should be done here. What is actually going on? What should we actually be preventing? What should we actually be fighting? What should our foreign policy be? Particularly what our foreign policy would be. Beginning from September the 11th, 2001, we've had a stupid foreign policy towards this part of the world which has caused far more trouble than it's solved. To continue to believe that tanks, bombs, airstrikes and boots on the ground will solve this problem when it's failed over all this length of time seems to me to be incredibly stupid.
Thank you for that. You've been sending us a lot of texts and tweets this morning. Tommy?
Yes, thank you, Sian. Yes, clearly a very emotive subject, and thank you for all the messages. Here are just some of them. Ian on Facebook says, Britain should stay out of other countries' business. It's simple. Always wanted to poke our noses in. It's causing more hate and more problems. Elaine makes a point that Peter Hitchens made today. It says, there should be no panic and no knee-jerk reactions. And she goes on to say that we should not allow them to divide and conquer either by blaming Muslims for this. Sue says, would it not be sensible to stop those who travel to Syria from re-entering the UK? Let them know that if they go, they will not be able to return. Bruce says, if we challenged anti-Muslim sentiment, would we deprive Islamic extremists of a vital nutrient without which it cannot flourish? And we've just had this video sent in from Paul.
In order to get this right at its root, one has to reform Islam. In much the same way that Christianity has been reformed, Islam needs a reformation. And without that, it's going to carry on recruiting lots of these suicide bombers, because in the end of the day, they are following what they believe is written down.
Islam needs reform, Sean. That's what Paul says.
Thank you very much. I want to pick that up with Chris, who joins us from our Birmingham studio. What do you make of that last comment about Islam needing reforming, and that's the way forward?
Well, I always find it interesting that non-experts can actually tell other religions what they need to do. It's like I'm not a theologian for Judaism, so I wouldn't tell the Jewish faith what it needs to do. I think that a lot of people kind of take these things on and they hear these debates about a reformation of Islam. I mean, what would that actually do? Religions change and they do evolve and they develop over many years, not just over centuries. These are constantly changing. What we have here is, and picking up on some of the points from previously, is that actually, if we get rid of Islamic State, if we bomb Islamic State, well, we create a void which is going to be filled by other extremists. If we look back to our own government in December 2013 and the Extremism Task Force, at that time, the British government was talking about the greatest threat coming from Al-Qaeda. So once Al-Qaeda, moves on, we get a new ideology which fills it.
What would you do, Chris? Sorry to interrupt, but we also heard that there are more than 700 British people who've gone out to Syria, and 400 or so have come back. Does that not give you cause for concern?
Well, I think it is concerning, but I think one of the things we've got legislation in place where actually my understanding is that when people come back from Iraq or Syria, that they can be arrested. So there's questions around why is the legislation not being used and why is the policy not there. I think one of the things that we've actually done, which is wrong, is this idea that we can actually kind of de-radicalise people here in this country. Right. If you look over, right back to New Labour in the post-77 period, we've had this huge investment from the British government in this kind of prevent agenda of trying to, take people off and make them, sort of much more moderate Muslims, if that's even a term. I mean, what do we mean by this? And I think that actually this hasn't worked. This has just been sort of, bringing Muslim organisations to the table that agree with government, rubber stamping, governmental ideas.
Thank you.
Chris Allen is pushing a particular point of view here. It's not one I agree with. A reformation of Islam, whatever that means, would mean that when an attack like this happened, there was no legitimacy whatsoever for it happening. And the problem is, and let me give you a very quick example. Take late last year, that young Jordanian pilot whose plane came down and he was burned alive in Syria by these ISIS barbarians. When that happened, Al-Azhar, the most important school of Sunni jurisprudence in Islam, issued a criticism of this happening. But they said, by the way, they said that the people who did it should be crucified for doing this, but they said that ISIS are indeed extremist, but the problem is that they are not heretics. They are not heretics. Now, Usama knows, and Yasmin knows, and everyone else here knows, this is a central problem. Chris Allen is right on one thing.
They are heretics.
This is not... Hang on. So can I just finish the point?
I think that was a mistranslation. Okay. What they said, they're not non-Muslim, you can't excommunicate them. Theologically, that's a problem.
But hang on, let Usama respond to your point, because is it about that sort of that clarity of message about what Islam is?
The message should be clearer, but the theologians of Islam today are unanimous. Every single one is condemning ISIS because they are killing so many Muslims everywhere. And Islam is going through a reformation, has been for the last century and a half.
I think
it takes centuries, as the Christian one did.
The elephant in the room is Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The man we treated like the king of the universe a few weeks ago. If you want to know how the theology has been kidnapped, restricted, homogenized, forcibly changed from the diversity that Islam enjoyed, you have to look to Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states. We don't want to do that.
No, it is an enormously important point, and Yasmin is quite right to raise it. And Saudi Arabia is, apart from anything else, hugely important in the formation of British and, I might say, French foreign policy, because it is such an important client, a buyer of arms, and
reform in Saudi Arabia will help Muslims worldwide.
All right.
Certainly.
It certainly needs.
The point is
Many
that this
thanks.
civil war is now here, and that is the problem.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you for all your comments at home as well. Just to say, if you are worried about friends and family in Paris, then the Foreign Office has a dedicated number to call. Here it is, 020 7008 0000. You can also find it on our website, bbc.co.uk/Sunday Morning Live. Coming up, veteran war photographer Don McCullin talks about portraying faith through a camera lens.
The idea of seeing various religions living in harmony in this country and showing you images of the best side of it can only increase the chances of understanding.
Around 2 million adults are dependent on drugs and alcohol in England. That's according to the latest statistics, with 1 in 12 having taken an illicit drug in the last year. Now, the word addiction is often used about overindulging in drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, even food. Is it, though, about compulsion, or is it a choice? Russell Brand suggested that drug addiction should be treated as a disease and a health issue, to be treated with compassion rather than condemnation. Peter Hitchens thinks that's nonsense, telling us this back in July when discussing whether obesity was an illness.
People use the word addiction the whole time. There is no such thing as addiction. It has no existence. There's no objective proof that any such thing exists. And it's the permanent excuse.
I can hear Liz saying, yes, there is, yes, there is.
No, there isn't. There's absolutely none. It's zero. There is no objective evidence for it. You cannot establish its presence in the human body.
OK. And we'll hear from Peter again in just a sec. First, though, we met Adam Bradford, whose father David's gambling habit became so severe he ended up going to prison.
We'd never even seen him gamble, to be honest, apart from when we went to the seaside, and it's just what you do, you spend, a little bit of time going to the amusements and just doing the fun stuff that families do. But we never had any suspicions of a gambling problem.
The trigger, I think, for my entering into gambling in a more than social way was financial pressures brought on by mismanagement in the finance, my own personal finances, and that delivered me to a false sense of potential solution in gambling.
We found out through the front page of our paper that he'd stolen £50,000 from his employer and had a gambling addiction. So, for us, we were kind of like, have they got, is this the wrong person? Is this the same David Bradford? But it was.
It's not because the core of me is bad, or I don't think so. I think it's that in the engine room of my mind, there's a bit of it not functioning properly. It's an illness which I've seen in other people now, and it manifests itself in a very similar way, but everybody's slightly different, and that's to do with their character that surrounds this illness. But the outcomes are always the same. We're kind of losers.
It's lost him his confidence in his job, his decency as a human. It could lose us our house. People who we might say are not addicted, who will turn around on the back of our story and say, it's his choice to do what he did. It affects the endorphins in your brain, just like drugs and alcohol do. That's been proven. We already know that the speed of gambling is getting quicker. There's many more adverts. The betting shops are expanding, and the industry is profiting from people like my dad who are getting into trouble.
The only thing I'm left with at the moment is trying to, day by day, edge into making things better for the future. Very, very difficult dragging that past with me, but it's the only way I can really function now. It's got to be treated like an illness because it's not a criminal thing. It might lead to that, but that's the result, not the cause.
Adam Bradford and his father David. Our question, is addiction an illness? What are your thoughts? Do email, text, call or use social media to get in touch with us this morning. Tommy will read some out a little later. Joining our panel this morning, actor and presenter Denise Welch, who says she's been addicted to smoking, drinking and overeating in the past. Dr. Eric Sigman, who's a health education specialist and author of Alcohol Nation, and Dr. Robert Lefevre, who set up Britain's first rehab centre, one of them, and specialises in addiction and depression. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining our panel this morning. Peter, as you were the one that sort of set all this off when you came in the summer, I just want to read something back to you that David said, and just a reminder, he stole £50,000 to fund his addiction. It's not because my core is bad. The engine room in my mind has a bit that's not functioning. He very much feels he was addicted, but you say that's a fiction.
You can't, I don't want to intrude into anybody's private grief, but you can't diagnose yourself with a disease. And I would defy anybody to come up with an objective, first of all, an objective definition of what addiction means, which doesn't very quickly change into something almost entirely opposite to it when you use it 10 minutes later, and also to come up with any kind of objective diagnosis of its presence in the human body. You can't say that someone is an addict in any objective way using scientific methods. So
does that mean therefore that they're not?
Well, what it means is that we're discussing something else. We're discussing a moral question. We're discussing the question of a society which increasingly is not willing to attribute personal responsibility to people, which makes excuses for almost everything people do, which is bad.
So
and once you do that, it makes it much easier for people to do those bad things.
Okay. Denise?
Well, I mean, I don't come on here as an expert on addiction, but obviously we've talked before. I can only talk about my own, and I think that what addiction is doing, with my problem, it started with clinical depression, which happened when I had my first son, Matthew. And I always think that no matter how advanced people are in the medical world, unless they've actually suffered from clinical depression, it's very difficult to describe. And I admit that I started self-medicating to stop the pain. I would have done anything to stop the pain of my clinical depression, which led me down a road. I also don't say that I didn't sometimes use recreational drugs for that reason. But what happened, I then became a vicious cycle. The more I used, the more I needed, the more it was compounding my depression, till I found I was in a desperate place, and the only thing that I felt that would stop my pain was cocaine and alcohol. But I was functioning, so I was convincing myself that I didn't have that much of a problem because I wasn't hiding gin bottles under the sofa and I wasn't drinking in the morning, which a lot of people who do have more of a problem.
But was it an addiction? Because what Peter's saying is it's a choice. It was a choice for you to go down that route.
It was a psychological addiction with me, I think, which is different to a physical addiction. But as I say, I've been working recently with Spitalfield Crypt Trust and seen people who are in the throes of a desperate physical addiction. Right. I think it can be both.
Let's talk to the psychologist then. And Dr. Sigman, I don't know whether your specialism is neuroscience. Can you tell us what happens in the brain when somebody has a compulsion to take drugs or alcohol or food or whatever it is?
To cut to the chase, I partly agree with Peter. You probably assume I'm going to completely disagree. No, I do think that our society does not want to take responsibility initially for the dabbling in addictive substances. But there comes a point, and I've even brought a picture with me here, there comes a point when you start to see brain changes. So, for example, this kind of change here may happen with just one night of binge drinking in the last 3 months. The red area is there in a teenager.
And what are the red areas?
The areas are where the brain cells are thinner, weaker, with less coating, and 18 different areas where you see the red marks go thin. Now, what this implies is that what may start out as a lack of willpower and hedonism may end up with neurological changes and neurochemical changes, which then take on a life of their own. And then it does become a physical process. Now, it's difficult to be exact in the diagnosis. This you're absolutely right about. But it doesn't mean that it may not be an illness. I mean, let's face it. There are many alcoholics who, if you take their alcohol away, they will die from the DTs. That isn't just a social affectation. So I think it depends on what area of the spectrum you're on, and it can be.
There's a slight slippage there. People who die from alcohol die fundamentally from having abused and taken vast quantities of a very dangerous drug for
What about these changes to the brain, though? The changes in neurotransmitters?
We know so little about the brain. Trying to judge causation from these things is like trying to work out what the North Korean government is thinking from satellite pictures of Pyongyang. It really, anybody who knows anything about neurology biology, the really hard science, and this knows that its knowledge of the brain, its functioning, is incredibly limited.
And growing very quickly.
Because we know so little, that doesn't make much difference. The truth is that we don't have any kind of causative proof of any connection.
That is a point, isn't it? I mean, we might have a relational, we might have a correlation between drinking and changes in the brain, but as far as cause is concerned, it's very difficult to prove.
Well, there's certainly
isn't it?
finding causation in damage, no question of
damage,
that.
no doubt. But that's very
damage
different.
of areas which can control self-control.
Anybody who knows anybody who drinks a lot.
Damage to the prefrontal cortex, the area that will stop you drinking too much, becomes damaged. Then your ability to control your drinking in future may be compromised.
Anyone who knows anyone who drinks a lot knows that they're damaged by it. And anyone who's worked in Fleet Street for as long as I have has met plenty of people in that state.
I'm delighted to find
news.
that I'm in agreement with Peter on so many things. I think there's a lot of rubbish talked about addictive disease. I think there's a lot of rubbish talked about depression, about alcoholism and so on. I think it's much more simple than that. Some of us, I think, have an addictive nature. I'm not entitled to talk about anybody else. I can just say two things. I've got one. I believe I was an addict since birth. I didn't come to terms with it until I was age 47, by which time I was in so much trouble. Everybody else knew I had a problem.
What were you addicted to in your view?
Oh, right across the board. I'm an addict by nature. But the things that got me into trouble, I lost 3 months' income on the turn of one card in a poker game. My weight used to vary by 50 pounds up and down. I was smoking 30 cigarettes a day when I was on the heart ward looking after people who were dying of cigarette smoking related illnesses, and so on and so on.
But why? What did you put this down to? When you say, you talk about an addictive personality or an addictive nature. Well, an addictive nature you talked about.
Nature,
but
I do
is it the sense then, as far as you're concerned, that some people are born with this addictive nature and they can't do much to shift it?
There are three causes. There's an antecedent cause, which I think is genetic. My mother's mother died of alcoholism, my father's father died of alcoholism, my wife's father committed suicide from his addiction, his father died of addiction, my mother had an eating disorder. My wife and I kept this genetic pool ticking over by marrying each other and breeding with each other. Our eldest son has addiction problems. He now runs a rehab. He's been very well trained for that. So I think there's just my family. But I've looked after over 5,000 inpatients. So I'm very familiar with other people's families. I've looked after the families.
Do you think addiction is a mental illness?
I think to use a term like mental illness conjures up so many other things that I'm equally concerned about. I don't like definitions that bring in things like mental illness, because it can be pejorative. It can be an abusive statement.
Could I raise a problem here, because it's important? The reason why this is so important is because of the way in which it causes us to treat the people who take illegal drugs.
Yes.
Also, I have to say, the way in which we treat people who destroy their families and ruin their own lives by drinking too much.
Yes.
Instead of saying, in the case of the illegal drug takers, you're breaking the law, well, we will punish you for it, we indulge them and say that they are suffering from a disease. We rob them institutionally. We rob them of the idea that they're responsible for their own actions.
I agree with you, Peter.
The same thing happens with people who drink too much. If you start telling them this is a disease, you're not responsible for it, then they are relieved of responsibility. Human weakness exists,
I agree.
and to redefine human weakness into a polysyllabic pseudoscientific word which relieves people of responsibility seems to me to be dangerous and wrong.
I agree with Peter on so much. It's a pity that we should disagree on anything, because I am totally responsible for my behaviour as far as it affects other people.
But it's about controlling that behaviour as well. What you're suggesting is you don't have control over your own behaviour.
Yeah, I don't have control. I have to find it.
Okay.
I'm not born with it.
And you have to treat the symptoms sometimes. It's like people who overeat. Of course, there are many people, and I'm sure you're probably the same as your colleague, who I won't mention, who is the eat less, move more. We all know that if we eat less and move more, we will lose weight. But I've been dealing with the program that I've been on, which uses cognitive behavioural therapy. We have to understand that shutting the cookie jar tin isn't enough. When we've got these fat, with these overweight children, there's a lot of pain involved in these children, and their comfort is the food. So it's not just as easy as to say, don't eat too much, run more, don't drink too much.
Never say it was easy.
But the way you talk about it, Peter, does seem as if we can just say, well, we should just stop drinking because it's an indulgence.
It's not a question of being easy. It's a question of whether it's a compulsion or not. And the whole basis of the use of addiction in our society, particularly in the way we treat people who take illegal drugs, is that it is a compulsion. If it were not a compulsion, then the whole reaction of the legal system to heroin heroin abusers.
Briefly,
would be
Aaron.
For some
wrong.
people, it is a compulsion. They'll kill other people. They'll do very extreme things to get the substance.
Well,
so again, it comes back to the
very
question:
selfish, not
what
compulsion.
area of
It's
the
not very
continuum are they
selfish.
on?
Let Eric finish.
How severely dependent are they on this particular substance? And at some points on that continuum, it is a compulsion, and it is a point at which it is a disease.
The world leader in the brain scans that you've been showing is Daniel Amen. He's done over 100,000 of those within his clinics. I met him in California, and I was very impressed with the work that he was doing, looking at the way that the brain is plastic. It changes.
Specifically in young ages. Those
That's
viewers
right.
right now who have teenagers at the moment, we know that it may switch on genes in the brain, making those teenagers far more likely to be addicted
All
than
right.
if they waited
Peter,
too long.
Let's hear, can I
Totally
hear
agree
from
on
those viewers,
cannabis.
because lots of people are getting in touch. Be with you in just a moment. Tommy, what are people...
Sian, yeah, Peter Hitchens, unfortunately, you're getting a lot of criticism on Twitter at the moment. John says, Hitchens is clearly, sadly, ignorant. Addiction is very real and frighteningly, often fatally tragic. It ravages individuals and families. This on Twitter says, addiction is real for sure and can't be simply dismissed by saying it's a myth. On the phone, though, Will says, as an ex-alcoholic, I don't think addiction is an illness, but rather just a very bad habit. Sean says addiction is an illness, but it's not like others. It's one that is only found out about after you start using drugs. And Simon's saying, nope, addictions are self-inflicted, like alcoholism and drug addiction as well. It's defo not an addiction.
All right.
Can I just carry on with what I was saying to Peter?
Yes.
About cannabis, I totally agree with you. It's a major damaging drug.
Oh, thank you so much. Do say that as loudly as possible.
I'll say it again. Cannabis is a major
Cannabis is a very addictive drug.
It'd be a crazy moment
And a very
to decriminalise
damaging
it
drug.
just when we're finding out how
totally
dangerous
agree.
it is. Thank you so much for saying
All
that.
right.
We'll talk.
Yeah.
And you will after this programme, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lots more to talk about. Thank you. All your reactions at home too. Do keep them coming in. Now, he's one of the greatest war photographers in history. Don McCullin risked his life to take pictures in places like Vietnam, Cambodia, the Congo, Afghanistan and Lebanon. And he's covered disaster and famine around the world. His latest role, though, saw him directing his gaze towards spirituality as a judge in an amateur photographic competition called Faith Through a Lens. Don told Asad Ahmed why the competition was so important.
The idea of of encouraging people to understand the love of religion and the devotion of religion. It's much more important than trying to, bully people into believing in a certain religion. So this competition, in a way, is a kind of broad competition that gives voice to all religions. What comes out of it is different points of view and, visually, and so you don't need a statement. A photograph can really tell you 1,000 words sometimes.
When it came to picking out the winners, a tough job, I'm sure. What were you looking at to pick out the runners-up and the winner that you did?
Once you see the winning picture, unanimously you all know it's got to be this picture. And in this particular case, it's a picture of an old black lady who's obviously very close to death, and she's being comforted by some religious person. It's in black and white, and the atmosphere of it absolutely kind of claws your imagination. This picture is full of touching love and tenderness, and you know right away this has got to be the winning picture.
If we look at the other finalists, we see a man teaching a young girl to read the Quran. What made you like that so much?
There's a perfect combination of teaching and trust and love. That's the way, as an Englishman, I want to see the Quran understood. I've never seen a picture like that where men are teaching girls. Normally it's women who are teaching young girls. But normally you see in Islamic teachers, mostly you see young boys being taught by teachers. So that's what's unusual about this picture as well. But it's a lovely, beautiful picture. And that's why we liked it. It gave us comfort and warmth to look at it.
And another finalist, a place you're familiar with, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, a man bathing himself there. What did you like about it?
I think this is a very spiritually moving picture because the man is alone in the water, and you can see that nothing in the world means more to him than being that privileged moment of that personal privileged moment, and you can see it in this photograph.
And do you think the photographs that have made it into the final 10 and the winner, it can help to change the way people think about those particular religions, religion in general?
I thought religion was about devotion and respect and love. And all I've seen is the kind of cruelty that sometimes religion, when it goes wrong, it doesn't go wrong. It's the people who observe it who go wrong. They go too far. So this competition, in a way, is meant to probably, cut out the political side of things and just concentrate on the love. The idea of seeing various religions living in harmony in this country and showing you images of the best side of it, really, can only increase, the chances of understanding.
Don McCullin talking to Asad Ahmed. A bunch of corduroy-jacketed lefty academics. That's how the London Mayor and MP Boris Johnson describes those taking part in some boycotts of Israel. The controversy surrounding his comments led to his appearance to a Palestinian charity on the West Bank being cancelled. He was referring to a protest against Israeli policies which started more than a decade ago but which has gathered momentum during the past year. In February, some British artists, including Roger Waters of Pink Floyd and the film director Ken Loach, signed a letter saying they would decline invitations to go to Israel and any funding from institutions linked to its government. Recently, their sentiments were endorsed by some university academics too. And last month, there was a counter-petition describing this cultural boycott as divisive and discriminatory. Among the signatories was the author J.K. Rowling, who described how the sharing of art and literature across borders constitutes an immense power for good in this world. So, are the arts powerful weapons of change, or does performing in countries whose policies you disagree with represent some sort of tacit acceptance? Our final question, do cultural boycotts work? And to discuss this, we're joined by Professor Jonathan Rosenhead, who's chair of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine. That's a group calling for an academic boycott of Israel. Mojisola Adebayo, who's an actor, playwright and director supporting the cultural boycott. And also joining us on the panel, Jonathan Shalit, an agent and talent manager, and Peter Hitchens, still here. First question, though, to Mojisola. What do you hope to achieve with a cultural boycott of Israel?
Well, I think one of the best things about a boycott is to open up a dialogue, which is what we're doing at the moment, what we're doing right now. It basically says there's a kind of bottom line, that the situation there is so appalling, is so bad, that all we can use is a very crude tool to say, actually, there's a point at which I'm not going to engage anymore in that kind of way. But there are lots of other things that we can do, which is what I'm about. And it's kind of, I'm a theatre maker, so it's kind of counterintuitive for me as an artist to say what I'm not going to do. I'm kind of much more interested in what I am going to do.
Because you're limiting free expression by doing this.
Well, I'm choosing all kinds of different kinds of expression, and I write plays, and I still work in the Middle East, and I still work in Palestine and with Palestinians. But really, for me, as an artist, it's about a choice about money, actually. It's a choice about what kind of cultural transaction I'm going to engage in.
Okay.
So I don't want to take money from a state that perpetrates an occupation.
You disagree with. Jonathan?
It's simply not true to say the situation in Israel is so appalling and so bad. The reality is Israel is the greatest democracy in the Middle East. Israel has lived with the kind of terrorism we see in Paris on Friday for 10, 20, 30 years. How Israel runs its internal security is Israel's business, and in many ways should be applauded. I think when you talk about boycott, it's like saying, well, why don't we, when George Bush was President of America, since half the world didn't agree with him, boycott America. I think the fact is, cultural, art, music, theatre can help, educate, entertain. And if you withdraw that from the people of a country, you're punishing the wrong people. I'm not saying we shouldn't debate Israel, we should debate every country. But it's the government, and please remember in Israel, as in Britain, the government does not represent even half of the country. So you're penalising the population of Israel. And if anything, you're marginalising them, because you're marginalising people who can't have access to world art.
OK. Jonathan, wherever you stand on the debate about Israel's policies, by doing this, by having this boycott, what you are effectively doing is preventing that free discussion, that open debate, and harming the very citizens that you would like to protect.
Well, I've had more discussion with Israeli academics since I had started boycotting them than before. It's just that I don't do business as usual. I don't do joint research grants with them and pretend that there is not a problem with Israel. I talk to them about the politics of Israel because they now want to talk to me because they know that I am involved in a campaign which criticizes them. So if you want dialogue, boycotts are a very good way of provoking it.
Dialogue is a very good way, well, boycotts are a very good way of provoking dialogue.
Well, that's
What are your
a
thoughts on
lovely paradox, but it's not really the point, is it? The point is, what are the boycotters actually aiming ultimately to achieve? I would guess their ultimate aim is to turn Israel into a pariah state, much as apartheid South Africa was, so that they can undermine its legitimacy and eventually remove it from the map, which tends to be the view of quite a lot of supposedly progressive people in the Western world these days. That doesn't seem to me to be a laudable objective or a wise one.
Didn't it work, though, with
weakest,
South
well,
Africa?
it did work, and that's what makes it so important. If it didn't work, if these things weren't important, why discuss them? But what worries me particularly about it, and what seems to me to be the weakest argument of the boycotters, is the selective nature of this. There are plenty of countries, China prominent among them, which behave extremely badly towards their own populations and towards their neighbours, who are not boycotted by the same people, and against whom there are no campaigns. I could name many others. And what interests me is why there is this strong selective desire to punish Israel of all countries, rather than any others, and would like to ask you why.
Well, you know, it's interesting what you're saying about China. I also don't work for the Chinese state. I've been invited many times to go and work on projects that are funded by the Chinese state. I also choose not to do that, but we're here.
Do you organise a boycott of China?
I don't organise a boycott, and I didn't organise this boycott, but I got an email in my inbox. But you know what? For me, it's a personal decision as well, in that I began my own kind of boycott from when I started working there. And I was first invited to work in Israel in 1999, and I worked in Nazareth, and I worked with so-called Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, and then I was invited back to work in the West Bank with a theatre company called Ashtar. And so I've been working there on and off since 2000, so the last 15 years, and I've seen the situation get progressively worse, and also in particular for artists,
but you're not
non-violent,
answering the question,
peaceful artists
the
who are trying to make their work, trying to make theatre, trying to make art. And the irony is, one of my own plays, one of the actors in my own plays, because she is born in Bethlehem, it's easier for her to perform in London than to perform in Jerusalem. She can't,
Okay.
my play, I can't have my play performed because of the occupation.
He just doesn't feel like his question's been answered.
May I answer? There's 2 points I'd make. First of all, the reason for the difficulty in getting from Bethlehem to Jerusalem is quite simply that Israel is trying to protect itself against a level of terrorism which we in this country would find wholly unbearable, and that's why it's not something that's been done deliberately to exclude people from Bethlehem from Jerusalem. Secondly, you haven't at all addressed my point. Why Israel, as against so many other countries, in many cases worse in their records, far worse in their records.
And it's Jonathan's point about it being a democracy. Why target a democracy? Why not go elsewhere?
Palestinian National Authority is also a democracy.
Okay.
But there are also Palestinians and Arabs in the Israeli parliament. Do you remember when you look at Israel, homosexuals, lesbians, gays, they're immersed in Israel society in many ways where they're not in other countries. We mentioned China. I would suggest that the more art that goes to China, the more chance the Chinese people understanding what they haven't got.
So you say, don't boycott, but go in and change the argument from within.
Yes, and do remember, Paul McCartney, Rihanna, Robbie Williams, the Rolling Stones, Madonna have all gone to Israel to perform. The great theatre companies of Britain go. The great orchestra of Britain go.
Elvis Costello didn't. I'm sure you've got lots of other examples.
But the point I'm making is I think the people not going are being naive. The truth of the matter is, if you don't embrace countries you disagree with, you can't move forward.
And it goes back to that point, doesn't it, about dialogue? It goes back to that point about art having and culture having a profound influence. And surely you can use that for your purposes.
I'm
by
sorry, there were a couple of
continuing
points that have gone by that really need to be picked up on. The reason why the actors can't go from Bethlehem to Jerusalem is because Israel is trying to exclude all Palestinians from Jerusalem, knocking down their homes, moving in Jewish settlers. It's not just security.
That point about change. Okay, point about changing from within, and academics and artists having the power to change from within rather than withholding their labour. Isn't that a more powerful one?
Absolutely, and that is because of the power of culture that the cultural boycott is an important element in this debate. And it's not reasonable to say you can't boycott Israel because you're not boycotting every other country in the world. Israel is, because it's open to us through its cultural and its academic and its economic lines, is open to the pressure of boycott. Boycott is not a moral obligation. It's a tactic you can use to put pressure on.
It's a tactic you can use against free, law-governed countries, but which is far less effective against iron dictatorships such as China. That's true.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, it would surely be more urgent to boycott an iron dictatorship than it would be to boycott a free, law-governed country.
Lots of comments coming in. Tommy.
Sian, do cultural boycotts work? Well, Daniel says, yes, I think they do. Peaceful protests seem to have more power and lastability over violent ones. Lee saying boycotts are just posturing and virtue signalling. How many of these people calling for a boycott of Israel will continue buying petrol from Saudi or clothes from Asian sweatshops? On Twitter, we've got the boycott of apartheid South Africa worked. Of course, cultural boycotts work. And finally, Oliver saying, why is it that Israel is singled out? Why not boycott Saudi, Zimbabwe, etc., who are real human rights abusers? Sian?
All right, thanks very much. And a point that you were making, Peter, but I just want to pick up with you, Mojisola, that point about is it something that you do which is peaceful, or is it simply posturing? What difference have cultural boycotts made since they were started a decade ago?
You know, it's not just about a decade ago, and you mentioned South Africa, and it was really powerful. It was really, really powerful. Can you imagine if Elvis had marched with Martin Luther King at Selma? What difference that might have made if Elvis had said, I'm not playing until the black man is free. What difference might that have made? It's not about violence, it's about peace. It's
Israel isn't like Alabama.
You know,
Israel is not like segregation.
South Africa was an apartheid state.
And so is Israel.
No, in Israel, you have Palestinians in government, but you also have Palestinians trying to kill innocent people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you. Thank you. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all my guests here today. Thanks to you at home for your comments as well. Now, in the light of the attacks in Paris, we thought we'd finish today with a song that brought great comfort to another city that was once shaken by senseless deaths. And it's the anthem of Liverpool Football Club. It was sung after the Hillsborough Stadium disaster. And its words echo David Cameron's sentiment and others to France that we stand together with you, united. So here are the Priests with You'll Never Walk Alone. Goodbye.
Through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. Let the air